He could have looked away. He could have finished his meal, left a tip, and walked back to his penthouse without a second thought. But he didn't. And that one moment, a steaming bowl of noodles passed across a sidewalk table on a cold Asheville night, set off a chain of events nobody could have predicted. An unlikely friendship, a dangerous secret buried inside City Hall, a corruption scheme stealing from the most vulnerable, and a love neither of them saw coming. This is their story. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The temperature had dropped faster than anyone expected that evening. By 7 o'clock, most of the outdoor tables along Lexington Avenue had emptied out. The kind of cold that settles into Asheville in mid-October doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, quiet and final, turning the mountain air sharp enough to cut through a light jacket like it's nothing. The string lights along the shop front swayed in a low wind. Leaves scraped across the pavement. The few people still walking had their shoulders pulled up to their ears and their eyes on the ground. Grayson Hale noticed all of it. He sat at a corner table at Faux Lien, a narrow noodle shop wedged between a laundromat and a used bookstore on the east end of the street. The restaurant had maybe 10 tables, half of them inside and 4 out on the sidewalk. Grayson was at one of the outside ones, which said something about him. Not that he liked the cold, but that he liked the distance. Inside felt too close. Too many people who might recognize a face they'd seen in a financial column or a charity gala photo. Out here, with a scarf pulled up and a plain wool cap pulled down, he was just a man eating alone, which was what he wanted. He'd been in back-to-back meetings since 7 that morning. A video call with his fund managers in Singapore. A 2-hour lunch with a city alderman who spent most of it talking about his own re-election campaign. 3 hours reviewing a portfolio acquisition that had gone sideways in ways his legal team was still trying to untangle. And then at 4:30, a call from Ethan's school. Not an emergency, just his son's teacher wanting to discuss how Ethan had been a little withdrawn in class lately, which was teacher code for something Grayson hadn't quite figured out yet. Ethan was 6. He'd been a little withdrawn since his mother left 18 months ago, and no amount of new toys or weekend hiking trips had fully cracked that shell. Grayson was working on it. He was always working on it. But tonight, for 2 hours, he needed to not be working on anything. So he'd driven himself. No driver, no assistant, parked 3 blocks away, walked to Faux Lien, and ordered the number 7. Beef broth, rice noodles, thin-sliced brisket, basil, a squeeze of lime. He'd been coming here once or twice a month for almost a year. Always alone, always the number 7, always the corner table outside if the weather allowed. The owner, a small Vietnamese woman in her 60s named Mrs. Nguyen, had stopped asking his name after the 3rd visit. She just nodded when he came in and put in his order without being asked. That kind of quiet recognition was exactly what he needed from the world right now. He was about 2/3 through the bowl when he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, maybe 15 feet from his table, slightly in the shadow where the string lights didn't quite reach. A woman in her early 30s, he guessed, though she had the look of someone who'd been weathered by more than her years. Her jacket was the wrong weight for October debt. Thin, olive-colored, the kind you'd buy at the end of summer on clearance. Her hair was dark and pulled back loosely, a few strands coming free around her face. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder that looked like it held more than just a purse. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the bowl in front of him. Then she looked at the menu on the chalkboard propped against the restaurant window, and he watched her do a calculation in her head, a fast, quiet, painful kind of math. She looked back at the bowl. She stood there for a long moment, then she walked up to his table. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady. She was working hard to keep it that way. "I hate that I'm asking this, but is there any chance you're not going to finish that?" Up close, she looked exhausted in a specific way. Not the "I had a long day" kind of exhausted. The kind that settles into a person's face after weeks of not sleeping well, of eating irregularly, of carrying something heavy with nowhere to put it down. Grayson looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at the bowl. "Actually," he said, "I was just about to order another one. The broth gets better when it cools a little. You want to sit?" She blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. "I don't need charity." "I didn't say you did. I just hate eating alone." He pulled out the chair across from him. "I'm serious about the broth, by the way. There's something about letting it sit." She stood there another 3 seconds, looking at him like she was trying to figure out the angle. When she didn't find one, she sat down. Her name, she told him later, not that night, but later, was Isla Bennett. But that first night she didn't offer a name and he didn't ask for one. Mrs. Nguyen came out with a fresh bowl, set it in front of her without blinking, and went back inside. Isla ate like someone who hadn't had a hot meal in a few days, which she hadn't. She ate carefully at first, like she was trying to look like she wasn't hungry, and then she stopped pretending and just ate. Grayson talked about nothing in particular. The weather, a book he'd been trying to read for 3 months and kept losing his place in. The way Asheville changed at night, how the tourist version of the city packed up and went home, and something quieter took its place. He talked enough to give her something to respond to without making her feel like she was being interviewed. She said a few things, short answers at first, then slightly longer ones. He didn't tell her his name. He didn't think it mattered, and he had a feeling that if she knew, if the name Grayson Hale meant anything to her, it would change the texture of the conversation in ways he didn't want. By the time she'd finished the bowl, she'd told him that she used to be a university student, that she'd been in Asheville for about 4 months, and that she was between situations, which they both understood to mean something harder than it sounded. "Thank you," she said when she stood up to leave. She said it plainly, without the excess of gratitude that sometimes made simple kindness feel transactional. "The soup's good, right?" he said. She almost smiled. "Yeah, it's good." She walked away down the street, and Grayson watched her go until she turned a corner. Then he finished his second bowl slowly, paid the bill. He always left Mrs. Nguyen a tip that was larger than the meal, and sat for another few minutes in the cold. He didn't know why he felt unsettled. He'd handed money to strangers before, had funded entire programs designed to help people in exactly her situation, but something about this felt different. Maybe because it was small. Maybe because it was real in a way that a wire transfer or a board meeting couldn't be. He pulled on his jacket, said goodnight to Mrs. Nguyen through the window, and walked back to his car. Across the street, on a bench outside the laundromat, Natalie Brooks had seen the whole thing. She hadn't meant to. She'd been waiting for a friend who was 40 minutes late, sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, scrolling through her phone out of habit more than interest. She'd looked up when she heard the woman's voice. She always registered voices that had that particular kind of controlled desperation in them, the kind she heard in her office every day. And she'd watched the whole exchange. The man had been calm, not in the way that people sometimes performed calm, the deliberate charity performance, the look how magnanimous I am energy, but genuinely, almost carelessly calm. Like buying a bowl of soup for a hungry stranger was just the obvious next move, not a decision at all. Natalie was a social worker at the Buncombe County Community Services Office, which meant she spent her days navigating a system so overcrowded and underfunded that even getting someone on a waiting list sometimes felt like a victory. She'd been doing it for 6 years. She'd learned to read situations quickly, who was in crisis, who was stable, who was right on the edge. The woman, dark-haired, thin jacket, canvas bag, was on the edge. Not falling, but close. The man was something else. She couldn't place him. He was dressed plainly, nothing flashy, nothing that would stand out. But there was something in the way he sat, in the ease of his posture, that wasn't quite ordinary. Like someone who'd spent so long being in control of a room that even sitting alone at a noodle shop, he still occupied the space differently than most people. She filed it away and forgot about it for 2 weeks. The second Thursday, Grayson was at the same table. He told himself he wasn't expecting anything. He was just getting the number 7 because he always got the number 7, and he was sitting outside because he preferred it outside. That was all. She appeared at 7:20, coming from the direction of the bus stop, that same canvas bag over her shoulder. She stopped when she saw him, and for a second he thought she was going to keep walking. "You're here," she said. "Every other Thursday or so," he said, which was only half a lie. He'd been twice a month before. Now he was thinking weekly. She sat down. Mrs. Nguyen brought out 2 bowls without being asked. Isla looked at the second bowl, then at him. "You ordered ahead of time?" "She reads minds," he said, which was also only half a lie. He'd come in 20 minutes early and asked Mrs. Nguyen if it was all right to expect a guest. They ate. This time the conversation came a little more easily. She told him her name. He gave her his first name only, Grayson, just Grayson, and she didn't press for more. She mentioned she'd been sleeping at a shelter on the south side, that the shelter was full most nights, that she'd been looking for work but it was hard without a permanent address for job applications. There are ways around that, he said carefully. I know, I've tried most of them. He believed her. She didn't strike him as someone who hadn't tried. They were quiet for a while. The street noise filled in the gaps. A car passing, someone laughing from inside the restaurant, the wind working its way through the gap between buildings. Why do you eat outside? She asked. He considered that. Easier to think out here. The walls feel a little far away. She nodded slowly like that actually made sense. I used to feel that way in lecture halls, she said. Like if the room was small enough, you couldn't get any real thinking done. What did you study? Environmental policy. She said it with a flatness that had something raw underneath it. 2 semesters from finishing my master's when everything went sideways. He didn't ask what sideways meant. He'd learned in that first meeting and in the 14 days since that pressing too soon closed doors faster than anything else. They stayed until the restaurant started dimming its lights for the night, nearly 9 o'clock. When she left, she said goodnight the way you say goodnight to someone you plan on seeing again. He sat for a few minutes after she'd gone, finished his tea, and thought about the master's degree in environmental policy that had been 2 semesters from finished and then wasn't. He thought about that for a long time. By the 3rd Thursday, there were 3 of them. Grayson had brought Ethan. He'd thought about it for a full week, argued with himself about whether it was a good idea, and then on Thursday morning, Ethan had woken up at 6, come into the kitchen in his dinosaur pajamas and said, Dad, can we go somewhere tonight? Somewhere that's not our apartment? And Grayson had looked at his son, small and serious-faced and carrying that quiet weight that 6-year-olds shouldn't have to carry, and said, Yeah, I know a place. Ethan sat between them at the corner table, kneeling on the chair because he was still a little short for it, and worked his way methodically through a bowl of broth and noodles with the kind of focused seriousness that small children bring to food they're deciding whether to trust. He kept looking at Isla sideways, the way kids do when they're curious but trying not to look curious. Your hair's very long, he announced after about 4 minutes. Isla looked at him. Yours is kind of messy. Ethan considered this. My dad forgets to comb it sometimes. Ethan, Grayson said, it's true. Isla pressed her lips together like she was fighting a smile. My dad forgot things sometimes too, she said. It's okay. That was the entirety of their first conversation. But by the end of the meal, Ethan had decided Isla was acceptable, which he communicated by leaning across the table and showing her a drawing he'd made at school, a house with a yard, which was notable because they lived in an apartment with no yard. This is where I want to live, he told her very seriously. It needs a dog. What kind? She asked, just as seriously. The medium kind. Not too big, not too small. That's a reasonable position. Ethan nodded. He appreciated being agreed with by adults. On the walk back to the car, Ethan slipped his hand into Grayson's and said, without preamble, I like her. Grayson looked down at him. Yeah? She didn't treat me like a little kid. You are a little kid. I know, but she didn't make it weird. Grayson didn't say anything else for the rest of the walk. But something shifted in him that night. Something he didn't have a word for yet, and wouldn't for a long time. Natalie Brooks saw him again on the 4th Thursday. By this point, she'd started eating dinner at Foley once a week, which she told herself had nothing to do with the couple, the man and the woman, and sometimes the small boy, who met at the corner table. She had her own reasons. The food was good. It was close to her office. That was it. But she noticed them. She noticed the way the man leaned forward slightly when the woman was talking, like what she said actually mattered. She noticed how the woman's posture changed week by week, tighter at first, guarded, and then gradually something releasing, some defensive architecture dismantling brick by brick. She noticed the boy with the uncombed hair who drew pictures and showed them to the woman like she was a credible audience. What she couldn't figure out was the man. There was nothing flashy about him. No watch that cost more than a car. No conspicuous phone. He drove himself. She'd seen him once, getting out of a dark SUV that was expensive but not aggressively so. He always paid cash at the restaurant, which in itself was interesting. Who paid cash anymore unless they were making a point of not leaving a trail? She went home that Thursday and typed a name into a search engine. She wasn't sure why. Professional habit, maybe. Or the nagging sense that something didn't add up. She typed, Grayson Hale, Asheville. The first result stopped her cold. She read it twice. Then she opened 3 more tabs and read those too. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at her ceiling for a long time. Because the man quietly eating noodles on a sidewalk in a wool cap, the man who ordered an extra bowl for a homeless woman without making it a performance, that man had, at the age of 26, co-authored federal housing policy guidelines that were still being used in 12 states. He had founded and sold 2 investment companies before 30. His charitable foundation had quietly funded food security programs in 4 counties across western North Carolina, including 2 programs whose funding origin Natalie's office had never been able to trace. He had disappeared from public life more or less completely about 2 years ago. The last interview she could find was a brief one in a financial publication in which he'd said, in response to a question about his next venture, something that stuck with her. I've spent a long time trying to fix things from the top. I'm not sure the view from up there is accurate enough. Then nothing. No columns, no galas, no quotes in policy papers. Just gone. Or rather, not gone. Just quiet. Living in Asheville under a name that was perfectly well known if you knew where to look, eating noodles on Thursday nights with a woman he'd met on the street. Natalie closed her laptop and sat in the dark for a while. She had the distinct and unsettling feeling that something was beginning, not ending, not continuing, but genuinely, irreversibly beginning. And she wasn't sure yet what her part in it was supposed to be. October gave way to November, and the cold in Asheville stopped being brisk and became something with more commitment. The Thursday dinners continued. Isla had been placed in transitional housing through a county program. A small studio in a building on the north side, not comfortable but not the shelter, which was something. She'd applied for a part-time position at a plant nursery on the edge of town, and on the second Thursday of November, she told Grayson she'd been hired. He kept his face neutral and said, "That's good," because he sensed that making too much of it would embarrass her, and she was still learning how to receive good news without bracing for it to be taken back. He understood that. He'd felt something like it himself, though from a different direction. The particular anxiousness of someone who'd had more than enough and still felt unsteady, which is its own kind of loneliness that has no good name. He still hadn't told her his last name. He knew, rationally, that he would have to at some point. People didn't exist without last names, and the longer he kept his out of circulation, the stranger the eventual reveal would feel. But every time he got close to it, every time the conversation drifted toward work or background or history, something stopped him. Not dishonesty exactly, more like fear. The specific fear that the information would change the way she looked at him, and that he'd already gotten used to the way she looked at him, straight on, without calculation, as if he were exactly as much or as little as he appeared. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him that way. Ethan, for his part, had become Isla's unofficial biographer. Every week, he brought her an update on developments at school, who had done something annoying, who had gotten a new lunchbox, what the PE teacher had said that made no sense. Isla received these reports with full seriousness, which Ethan required. She asked follow-up questions. She had opinions about the lunchbox situation. She did not treat it like a child talking about small things. She treated it like what it was, which was a small person trying to make sense of his small world, which is not a small thing at all. One night in late November, after Ethan had fallen asleep in the back seat on the drive home, he always crashed hard on Thursday nights, overstimulated from the dinner conversation. Grayson sat in the parking garage of his building for a long time before going inside. He thought about the way Isla had laughed that evening. It was the first time he'd heard her actually laugh. Not a polite sound, not a managed smile, but something real and a little unguarded that she seemed slightly surprised to have produced. He thought about his son's hand-drawn map of a house with a yard and a dog. He thought about what it meant that the first hours of his week he genuinely looked forward to were Thursday evenings at a noodle shop, and what that said about the other hours. He didn't have answers. He mostly had questions, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to resolve them immediately. He just sat in the parking garage, in the quiet, with the questions, and that was all right. The snow came in December without much warning. It came on a Thursday. Of course it did. And Grayson arrived at Folian early and moved the corner table inside, rearranging 2 chairs near the window so they still had the view of the street but were out of the cold. Mrs. Nguyen watched him do this without comment and brought out a pot of hot jasmine tea. Isla arrived 8 minutes late, cheeks red from the cold, and stopped when she saw the inside table. "You moved it inside," she said. "It's snowing." "I can see that." She sat down and wrapped both hands around the teacup. Her knuckles were dry and a little cracked. She'd been working outside at the nursery. She didn't mention it. "Ethan's not coming tonight?" "He has a thing at school, a winter concert or something. His teacher specifically said he has to practice the recorder, and I apparently need to look interested." Isla laughed. The real laugh, not the polite one. "Poor kid. The recorder is a genuinely bad instrument." I wasn't going to say it. Somebody should. Outside, the snow was coming down steadily. The street had gone quiet in the way streets do under snow. All the edges softened, all the usual noise absorbed. Through the window, Folian looked like a photograph of itself. They ate slowly, and the conversation moved in a different direction than it usually did. Less practical, less surface level. Isla talked about her degree. Not defensively, the way she had before, but with something more like grief. The research she'd been doing on urban watershed management, the thesis she'd been 6 weeks from completing when her mother got sick and her financial situation collapsed faster than she'd been able to stop it. "I kept thinking I'd defer for 1 semester, she said. "That turned into 2. Then I lost the apartment, and after that it felt, I don't know, it felt like something that belonged to a different version of me." Grayson was quiet for a moment. "Does that version of you feel very far away?" She thought about it seriously. "It did. When I first got here. Now sometimes I feel like—" She stopped, looked out the window. "Like maybe it's not as far as it seemed." He nodded. He didn't add anything to that. Some things didn't need adding to. After the check was paid, she asked, very quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why are you—" She stopped, rearranged the question. "What do you do? Like, actually, you never talk about it." There it was. He set down his tea. Outside, the snow kept falling. In the window reflection, he could see both of their faces overlaid on the white street, ghost-like. "Investments, mostly," he said. It was true. It was also massively incomplete. She looked at him like she knew it was incomplete. "Investments. Private equity, some real estate, a foundation that funds community programs." He paused. "I had a different life a few years ago, more public. I got tired of it." She was quiet. Then, "Is that why you use only your first name?" He met her eyes. "Yeah." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, once, a small nod that said she wasn't going to push it, that she understood the particular need to occupy a life that other people hadn't entirely pre-furnished for you. "Okay," she said. They left together, walked a half block in the snow, and said goodnight at the corner. He watched her turn toward the bus stop, her thin jacket inadequate even with the scarf she'd added, and he thought, that jacket is going to be a problem in January, but he also thought about that nod. The way she'd said okay, not with suspicion, not with calculation, just, "Okay, I understand you're allowed your reasons." He walked back to his car with snow collecting on his shoulders and thought that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be understood at that particular low volume, the kind that didn't require explanation. He thought about it the rest of the way home, up the elevator, into the apartment where the heat was on and Ethan's recorder was sitting on the kitchen counter next to a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a wolf wearing a hat. He picked up the drawing and looked at it for a long time. Then he put it on the refrigerator, where it stayed. January arrived the way it always does in Asheville. Not gradually, not with warning, but like someone had simply decided overnight that warmth was over, and cold was the new permanent condition of things. The mountains held the chill in their valleys and kept it there. By the second week, the temperature at night dropped into the low 20s, and the sidewalks along Lexington Avenue turned glassy and dangerous after dark. Grayson noticed, on the first Thursday of the new year, that Isla had a different jacket. It wasn't new. The sleeves showed wear at the cuffs, and there was a faint stain near the left pocket. But it was heavier than the olive-colored things she'd worn through October and November and December, and it was clearly warmer. He didn't comment on it. She didn't explain it, but he saw her clock the noticing in his expression, and she gave him a look that was half warning, half amusement, as if to say, "Don't." He didn't. Instead, he told her about Ethan's recorder recital, which had taken place the week before, and had been every bit as painful as advertised. 23 first graders playing what was technically jingle bells, but sounded more like a fire alarm in an argument with itself. He'd sat in the second row and clapped at the right moments, and told Ethan afterward that it was really something, which was true in the most neutral possible interpretation of the word. Isla laughed, the real laugh, the one that had started appearing more regularly in the past few weeks. Did he know it was bad? He absolutely knew. He came out of the auditorium and said, "I don't think I'm a recorder person." And I said, "That's a very mature self-assessment." What did he say? He said, "Can I quit?" And I said, "Let's give it until spring." And he said, "That's not what I asked." She was still smiling. He's 6 and he's already negotiating? He's been negotiating since he was 4. I think he was born with a contract in his hand. She shook her head, but there was something soft in it. She'd become genuinely fond of Ethan in a way that Grayson recognized as real and not performed. The way she remembered things he'd mentioned weeks earlier. The way she asked follow-up questions about his school situation with actual curiosity rather than the mild, obligatory interest that adults usually brought to conversations about other people's children. "How's the housing situation?" he asked, after a pause that had a different texture than their usual pauses. "Fine. Same." She wrapped both hands around her soup bowl. "The building has a noise issue at night. Someone 3 doors down plays music until 2 or 3 in the morning. Not loud exactly, but you can feel it through the wall. Have you talked to the building manager?" She gave him a flat look. "The building manager is the one who's letting the lease run month to month without a formal contract. I'm not in a position to complain about anything." He understood that without needing it, explained further. The arithmetic of precarious housing, the way it required a constant, exhausting calculation of what you could push back on and what you had to absorb, because the alternative was being back outside. He'd read enough about it in policy terms to understand it intellectually. Hearing it from her, sitting across a table, made it land differently. "The nursery job," he said. "Still okay?" "It's fine. The hours are inconsistent in winter. Less to do when nothing's growing." She looked out the window at the street, where a thin layer of ice still sat at the curb from 2 nights before. "I've been picking up a couple of shifts at a coffee place on Merrimon. It's not great money, but it keeps the hours consistent." "Are you sleeping?" She looked at him. It was a slightly unusual question, and they both knew it. "More than I was. Why?" "You look tired." "Thank you. That's a very charming thing to say." "I didn't mean it as a criticism." "I know." She wasn't offended, just slightly deflecting. "I'm fine, Grayson. I'm managing." He let it go. She was managing. That was true. It was also different from being okay, and he knew the difference, but she hadn't asked him to solve anything, and he was trying to learn the line between caring about someone and turning their life into a problem you'd decided to fix. It wasn't an easy line to stay on. He'd spent most of his adult life being the person with resources and reach, and the ability to make things happen, and the reflex to intervene was built deep. He had to make a conscious choice every Thursday to just sit there, to ask, to listen, to let her carry what was hers to carry without reaching over and taking it. It was harder than it sounded. Ethan was with them again that night. He'd been asking since Monday whether it was Thursday yet, which Grayson took as information. He sat across from Isla with a new drawing he'd been working on, which he presented to her with the gravity of a museum curator unveiling something significant. It was a picture of three people at a table outside, recognizable only because one was tall, one was medium, and one was very small and had what appeared to be extremely large feet. "That's us," Ethan explained, in case it wasn't clear. "I can see that," Isla said. "You got the feet exactly right." "Dad has big feet." "I do not," Grayson said. "Size 12, Ethan told Isla confidentially. She pressed her lips together. "That is, objectively, a large shoe." Grayson pointed at his son. "You're 6. You can't be on her side." "I'm not on anyone's side," Ethan said, which was a lie delivered with impressive calm for a first grader. Isla kept the drawing. She folded it carefully and put it in her canvas bag, which she still carried everywhere, though its contents had shifted over the months from survival essentials to something more ordinary: a library book, a water bottle, a small notebook she'd started keeping. Grayson had noticed the notebook a few weeks ago and hadn't asked about it, but he'd seen her scribbling in it sometimes while she waited for him to arrive, and the quality of her focus when she did suggested it was more than a grocery list. She was still thinking. That was what the notebook meant. She was still turning ideas over, still engaging with the world in whatever way she'd been engaging with it before everything fell apart. That mattered to him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The Thursday dinners had become, without anyone declaring them to be, the fixed point of Grayson's week. Everything else could shift. Meetings moved, calls got pushed, Ethan's school schedule changed, but Thursdays were constant. He'd begun, quietly, to arrange his work calendar around them, which was the kind of thing he'd never done for anything that wasn't an investment or a board meeting. He didn't examine this too carefully. He wasn't ready to. It was around this time that Natalie Brooks made her first direct appearance in their lives, though none of them knew it yet. She'd been thinking about what she'd read. About Grayson Hale, former policy architect, disappeared billionaire, quiet noodle shop regular. And she'd gone back and forth for weeks about whether to do anything with the information. It wasn't her business. The woman with the canvas bag was clearly not in immediate crisis. She was housed, she was working, she was eating warm food on Thursdays. That was more than a lot of people Natalie dealt with. But the idea had been building in Natalie's head for months, fed partly by that first encounter on the sidewalk, and partly by the daily reality of her job, which was a machine that processed human need and produced, with remarkable consistency, not enough. The paperwork required to access basic services was designed, in its complexity, to exclude the people who needed them most. She'd watched people fall through gaps that existed not by accident, but because no one with power had found it inconvenient enough to close them. She'd been drafting something, a proposal, rough and incomplete, for a program she was calling Safe Harbor, a navigation system, essentially, a way for people in precarious situations to access services without having to understand a bureaucratic structure that had been built for administrators, not for the people it was supposed to serve. A single point of contact, clear pathways, no 6-month waiting lists for an intake interview. It was a good idea. She knew it was a good idea. She also knew that good ideas died in committee rooms in City Hall every week, killed by budget concerns and political maneuvering and the general institutional resistance to anything that disrupted the existing order. What she needed was someone who understood both sides, the human reality of what she'd seen on that sidewalk in October, and the structural mechanics of how policy actually got made and funded. She knew who that person was. She just wasn't sure yet how to get in front of him without making it weird. The opportunity came, somewhat anticlimactically, on a Tuesday morning in late January when she walked into Folien to pick up a takeout order and found Grayson Hale sitting alone at the counter, talking to Mrs. Nguyen about whether the restaurant's ventilation system was going to survive another winter. He was not in disguise, he was just a man in a plain jacket talking about ductwork. Natalie stood at the register for a moment, takeout bag in her hand, and made a decision. "You're Grayson Hale," she said. Not accusing, not reverent, just a statement of fact. He turned and looked at her with an expression she'd learned to recognize later as his particular version of being caught. Not guilty exactly, but slightly resigned, like a man who'd known this moment was coming and had been hoping to postpone it a little longer. "Depends on who's asking," he said. "Natalie Brooks. I'm a social worker at the county office on Patton." She held out her hand. "I've seen you here on Thursdays, with Isla." Something shifted in his expression at the name. Not alarm, more like a door closing quietly. "She's a friend," he said carefully. "I know. I'm not here because of her, specifically." She sat down on the stool next to him, because standing in front of someone while holding a takeout bag was not a position of authority, and she needed to at least be at eye level. "I have an idea I've been working on. A program. And I've been trying to figure out who to talk to about it, who would actually understand how the pieces fit together, and then I did some reading, and—" She paused. "You wrote the Hendricks Callaway Housing Framework." He looked at her for a long moment. "That was 8 years ago." "It's still being used in 11 states, 12 if you count the Virginia revision last spring." He was quiet. She could see him deciding how much to engage. "What's the program, Chet?" he finally said. She told him. Not the full version. She didn't have the full version yet, but the core of it. The navigation model. The single point of contact idea. The way existing services were technically available but practically inaccessible to the people who needed them. She talked for about 7 minutes, which was longer than she'd planned, because once she started, she found the words moving faster than they usually did, fueled by the simple fact of talking to someone who was following every word without the glazed patience that social workers usually encountered when pitching to people with money. When she stopped, he was looking at the counter. "The intake redundancy is the real problem," he said. "People in crisis shouldn't have to tell the same story to 6 different intake workers." "No, they shouldn't." "What's the funding model?" "County grant to start, federal supplement if it proves out." She hesitated. "There are also some private foundation options I haven't fully explored." He didn't react to that, but she noticed a small shift in his posture, something that was not quite confirmation but wasn't denial either. "The political piece is the hard part," she said. "The county council has 3 members who would actively block anything that changes how existing services are administered, because the existing administration is connected to interests I haven't been able to fully map yet." He looked at her then, sharply, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of a general problem, but of a specific one. Like she'd said something that matched a shape he'd already been thinking about. "What members?" he said. She told him. He nodded slowly, once, and said nothing. But she had the distinct feeling that he was filing the names somewhere important. They talked for another 20 minutes, through her takeout food going room temperature, until Grayson's phone buzzed with something he had to deal with. He stood up, put on his jacket, and then stopped. "I don't usually get involved in local politics anymore," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I understand. But if you put together a formal proposal, I'd look at it." She kept her face neutral. "Okay. Not a favor. I'd look at it because the idea is structurally sound, and the problem is real." He said this with the slight firmness of someone establishing terms before a conversation gets away from him. "I know," she said. "That's why I asked." He almost smiled. Then he left, and Natalie sat at the counter for another minute with her cold takeout and the feeling of something clicking into place. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but clicking. The program proposal had been a document of vague intentions and hopeful language until that morning. By the time she got back to her office, she had 7 pages of specific structural notes on her phone and a much clearer sense of what she was actually building. She worked on it every evening for the next 3 weeks. In the meantime, the Thursday dinners continued, and something between Grayson and Isla continued shifting in the particular way of things that neither person is fully acknowledging, but both are feeling. It was becoming harder to describe their relationship in practical terms. She wasn't someone he'd hired or helped in a formal sense. She'd never asked him for anything, and he'd learned to offer things sideways through implication in ways that didn't position her as a recipient of his generosity. A book he'd finished that he thought she might find interesting. A mention, carefully framed, of a scholarship program he'd read about for graduate students returning after an interruption. Not pushing, just leaving doors slightly open. She walked through some of them and left others closed, and he respected both responses. What was growing between them didn't have a clean name yet. It wasn't exactly friendship. It had too much awareness in it for that. Too much of the specific attention that people pay to someone they're trying to understand at a level below the surface. It wasn't romance, at least not in any declared sense, but it was something. Grayson knew it the way you know when a room's temperature has changed without being able to point to exactly when it happened. Ethan, being 6 and therefore completely without the adult capacity for self-deception, had already named it. "You like her," he told his father one morning, very matter-of-factly, while Grayson was making breakfast and not thinking about anything in particular, or telling himself that. "She's a friend," Grayson said, which was the same thing he'd told Natalie and was becoming less convincing each time he said it. "That's not what I mean," Ethan said. Grayson looked at his son. "You're 6. "I know. Go get your backpack." Ethan went, but he had the expression of someone who'd made a point and was willing to let it sit. Grayson stood at the stove and thought about that expression for the rest of the morning. February moved through with its particular gray stubbornness, the kind of month that doesn't have the novelty of January's cold or the warmth of what's coming. It's just February, long and low-lit and requiring a kind of daily commitment just to get through. Isla was quieter than usual in February, not withdrawn. She still showed up on Thursdays, still talked, still asked Ethan about his week with genuine interest. But there was something running underneath that Grayson could feel without being able to identify. She was working through something. He gave her the space for it without asking what it was. She told him on the 3rd Thursday in February, unprompted, between the soup and the tea. "I called the admissions office," she said. He waited. "At the university. UNC Asheville." She was looking at the table. "I talked to someone in the graduate program's office about what it would take to come back." "And?" "It's complicated." She picked up her spoon and set it down again. "My advisor is still there. The research is still technically on file, but it's been 2 years and the funding I had, the fellowship, that's gone. And there's a re-enrollment process that takes 3 to 6 months." She paused. "And I don't have, even with the job, I'm barely covering the studio. Graduate tuition is..." "There are options," he said carefully. "I know." She finally looked up. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I know you're not. I'm just..." She stopped, rubbed the back of her neck. "I'm just telling you because you asked once what that version of me felt like, the one who was finishing the degree, and I said it felt far away. And right now it feels less far away, and I thought you'd want to know that." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car honked somewhere down the street. The restaurant was warm and slightly foggy with steam from the kitchen. "Yeah," he said. "I wanted to know that." She nodded, looked back at the table, and picked up her spoon again. It was the most direct either of them had been about what these dinners were actually doing, and neither of them called it what it was, which was 2 people quietly pulling each other forward in a direction they hadn't known they were heading. It was also the night that Grayson made a decision he'd been circling for weeks. Not about Isla, not about whatever that was, which he still wasn't prepared to name. A different decision. He'd been making calls, quiet ones, the way he did everything now, without announcement, without press, without the machinery that used to follow his every professional move. He'd been talking to people he trusted, pulling on threads he'd noticed in Natalie's account of the blocked political situation. 3 city council members with a pattern of blocking social service initiatives, budget line items that didn't quite add up, public contracts that went to companies with names he hadn't recognized until he dug a layer deeper and found something he recognized all too well. Money moving in circles, dressed up as public service. He'd seen it before, not in Asheville specifically, but in the broader architecture of how city-level politics worked when someone with enough influence decided that the existing dysfunction was more profitable than reform. He'd spent 3 years once trying to work within that kind of structure and learning exactly how it absorbed well-intentioned people without changing itself at all. He wasn't going to do that this time. He didn't tell Isla any of this. He wasn't sure how to, and he wasn't sure it was his story to tell, not yet. But he went home that Thursday night and sat at the desk in his home office, the one he used for the work he didn't discuss at noodle shops, and opened his laptop and started writing down everything he'd found in the cleanest, most documented form he could manage. He worked until 2 in the morning. Ethan slept in the next room, making the small breathing sounds of a child who'd eaten well and had no unresolved questions. The wolf with a hat drawing was still on the refrigerator. The city was quiet outside the window, all its complications invisible from this height. Grayson wrote until his eyes hurt, then saved the document to 3 separate locations and went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about Isla's face when she'd said it feels less far away, and the particular quality of that, the way some distances collapse not all at once, but increment by increment, so slowly you almost don't notice until you turn around and realize how far you've come. He thought about Ethan's drawing of 3 people at a table. He thought about the map Ethan had mentioned wanting to make. A real map, he'd said, with a house at the center. Eventually, he slept. The document sat on his hard drive, patient and waiting, full of names and numbers, and the shape of something that had been hidden for a long time under layers of ordinary-looking official business. Outside, Asheville was cold and quiet, and the mountains sat in the dark the way they always did. Older than anything happening among the people below them, not indifferent exactly, just measuring time on a scale that made urgency feel relative. But the people below them were not measuring time on that scale. They were measuring it in Thursdays, in soup bowls, in the distance between where someone had been and where they might yet go. And on that scale, things were moving, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks still ahead that none of them could see yet, but moving. March came in cold and stayed that way longer than anyone wanted. Natalie had submitted the safe harbor proposal to the county grants office on the last Friday of February, which meant it was now sitting in a review queue somewhere in a building on College Street, waiting to be read by someone who may or may not understand what they were reading. She'd done everything right. The structural framework was clean, the budget projections were conservative and documented. The needs assessment drew on 6 years of her own case data. Grayson had reviewed the final draft twice and made 12 specific suggestions, all of which she'd incorporated. And on the evening she sent it, she'd sat in her car in the parking lot outside her office and felt, for approximately 4 minutes, genuinely hopeful. Then she went home and made herself stop feeling hopeful, because hope in the social services context was a resource that needed to be rationed carefully or it would run out before you needed it most. The waiting was the worst part. It always was. She filled the time with her caseload, which was never short of filling, and with the quiet background work of mapping the political landscape around Safe Harbor. Who would support it? Who would resist it? And most importantly, who was resistant for reasons they wouldn't say out loud. She'd told Grayson about the 3 council members. He hadn't elaborated on what he was doing with that information, and she hadn't asked, because she'd been around enough careful private people to understand that asking too directly would get her less than waiting. But he'd been doing something. She could tell by the occasional text he'd send, a question about a specific contract number or the name of a firm she'd never heard of, or once, cryptically, whether she knew if the city's community development block grant had been audited in the last 3 years. She'd looked it up. It hadn't. She passed that information along and didn't ask why he wanted it. Meanwhile, Isla was moving. Not physically. She was still in the studio on the north side, still working split shifts between the nursery and the coffee place on Marymount. But something was shifting in her trajectory, and Natalie, who had started exchanging occasional words with her at Faux Lien on Thursday evenings, could see it. The canvas bag now always had the small notebook in it, and sometimes a library book with markers sticking out at multiple pages. She'd mentioned, carefully and without much detail, that she'd been in contact with someone at the university. Her advisor. A woman named Dr. Pierce, who apparently had not forgotten Isla's research and had, according to Isla, said something encouraging enough that Isla had written it down. She said the data is still solid, Isla told Natalie one Thursday in early March, while Grayson was inside getting a refill and Ethan was occupied with a drawing. Like the watershed data I was collecting before, she said the methodology holds up and the 2 years actually give her more to work with in terms of seasonal variation. Natalie looked at her. That sounds like your advisor telling you to come back. It sounds like my advisor being kind. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Isla looked down at the table. The money piece is still real. I know, Natalie paused. But sometimes the money piece has solutions you haven't found yet. It was as close as she could come to saying what she knew without saying it directly, which was that Grayson's foundation had a graduate scholarship program that had quietly funded 11 returning students in the past 4 years, none of whom had known the source of the funding because that was exactly how he'd structured it. She'd discovered this not from Grayson, but from a footnote in a county education report she'd been reading at 11 at night in her apartment, which was how she found most of the things she found. She hadn't told Isla. She wasn't sure it was her information to give, but she filed it alongside everything else she knew and didn't say, which was becoming a substantial collection. Grayson came back to the table with 2 cups of tea and the neutral expression of someone who hadn't been standing at the counter long enough to hear anything. Ethan immediately presented his new drawing, which was a map, not a house map this time, but an actual cartographic attempt, complete with a compass rose that had the cardinal directions in the wrong order. "North is up," Grayson told him. "That's a rule someone made up," Ethan said. Grayson looked at Isla. She shrugged, which was not the backup he'd been hoping for. "He has a point," she said. "Someone did make that up." "Thank you," Ethan said, and went back to his map. Grayson sat down and wrapped his hands around his tea and looked out at the street. March in Asheville had the particular quality of a city deciding whether to wake up, crocuses coming through in patches, a warm day sandwiched between cold ones, everyone aware that winter wasn't gone, but hopeful it was at least leaving. He felt something similar in himself, a slow thaw of something that had been frozen for longer than he'd admitted to himself. He looked at Isla. She was reading something in her notebook, one finger tracing a line of text she'd apparently written earlier. Her brow was slightly furrowed in the way it got when she was working through an argument in her head. He'd learned to recognize it, the same way he'd learned to recognize the specific pause before she said something she'd been carrying for a while. He'd learned a lot of things about her in 5 months, more than he knew about most people he'd worked with for years. That bothered him a little. Not the knowing, but the fact that he'd been closer to strangers in boardrooms for longer and still couldn't have told you how they took their coffee. He looked at her and thought, I'm going to have to tell her. Not just about his name or the foundation or the particular shape of his financial life, about what he'd been finding in those late-night documents, about what was being done, deliberately, to keep programs like Natalie's from getting off the ground. But not yet. Not until he had the full picture. He'd learned, the hard way, that partial information presented too early created confusion rather than clarity, and Isla had enough to navigate without adding his complications to the pile. He told himself that was the reason for waiting. Most of the time he believed it. The full picture, as it turned out, was closer than he'd thought. The second week of March, a contact of his, a former policy colleague named Marcus who now worked in municipal finance consulting, sent him a file, 47 pages. Contracts, invoices, internal memos, email chains with subject lines that were carefully bland and contents that were anything but. Marcus had been pulling threads for 6 weeks at Grayson's quiet request, and what he'd found was not surprising, exactly. It had the smell of exactly what Grayson had been expecting, but it was more documented than he'd hoped, which was both good and terrible. 3 city council members, 1 deputy director of community development, and a network of shell company contracts that had been routing public funds, specifically federal block grant money earmarked for community services, into private development projects dressed up with community benefit language that meant almost nothing on closer examination. The scheme had been running for at least 4 years, possibly longer, but the document trail before 2021 was thinner, either because the record-keeping was less consistent or because someone had been thoughtful about managing the archive. The effect, practically, was that programs like Safe Harbor, programs that drew from the same grant pools, were being systematically underfunded or routed into bureaucratic review processes that delayed them until the funding windows closed. It wasn't dramatic corruption. It wasn't a heist. It was the slow, patient, boring kind. The kind that required no villain speeches, just the consistent application of procedural pressure in exactly the right places. Grayson sat with the 47 pages for 2 days. He read them the way he used to read investment prospectuses, which was with the full understanding that every document tells 2 stories, the one it's trying to tell, and the one you can find in the gaps. The gaps here were substantial. He called Marcus on a Wednesday evening and they talked for 90 minutes, Grayson pacing his apartment while Ethan watched something with headphones on in the other room. How solid is this? Grayson asked. The contract documentation is airtight, Marcus said. The email chain is going to require some legal interpretation, but the financial flows are documented enough that any competent forensic accountant could reconstruct the story. And the timing? The last transfer was 6 weeks ago. This is ongoing. Grayson stopped pacing. They're still running it. Far as I can tell, yes. The Safe Harbor Grant Review. Marcus paused. I found an internal email from the deputy director's office. The language is vague, but the implication is that the review is being extended, not for substantive reasons. Grayson sat down. They're running out the clock on the grant window. That's what it looks like. You've got maybe 8-9 weeks before the funding cycle closes. After that, the program either dies or starts over from scratch next year. 8 weeks. Grayson looked at the wall, at Ethan's wolf with a hat drawing, which had migrated from the refrigerator to the hallway sometime in the past month, at the closed door of the room where his son was watching something uncomplicated with headphones on. Okay, he said, I need to think about the right way to bring this forward. Grayson, Marcus's voice had a caution in it. If you go public with this, your name is going to be on it. You understand that? I know. You've been very deliberately not having your name on anything for 2 years. I know, he said again. A silence on the line. Then Marcus said, Okay, I'll hold the file. Tell me when you're ready to move. He hung up and sat in the quiet apartment for a long time. Ethan had fallen asleep at some point, still wearing the headphones, which Grayson discovered when he went to check on him. His son curled on the couch with the tablet dark beside him, the headphones askew, breathing the deep, regular breath of a child completely at peace with the world. Grayson straightened the blanket and turned off the lamp and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the city. He'd left the public world for reasons that still held. The machinery of visible power was exhausting and distorting in ways he hadn't fully understood until he'd stepped away from it and felt his own thoughts clarify. He didn't miss the coverage, didn't miss the meetings in rooms where everyone's primary agenda was something other than what they claimed, didn't miss the constant calculation of how everything he said would look, rather than whether it was true. But something had been building since October, since a bowl of soup on a cold sidewalk, since the look on Ethan's face when Isla took his drawing seriously, since Natalie's 7-minute pitch at Folian that had been structurally sound and completely without an angle, since 47 pages of documentation showing him exactly what happened to the people who fell through the gaps when the people in charge of the gaps decided the gaps were profitable. He thought about Isla calling her university advisor, about the notebook with the marked pages, about 2 semesters from a degree that meant something to her. He thought about how many people he'd never meet whose situations were variations on hers, and who didn't have a Thursday dinner to come back to. He made a decision, not a clean one. There was nothing clean about it. It had complications attached to it that he'd spend weeks dealing with, but a real one, the kind that settles into you as you're making it and doesn't require confirmation later. He would go to Natalie in the morning. She was in his office by 9:15, which meant she'd rearranged her morning caseload, which meant she'd understood from his text that it was urgent without him having to say so. She sat across from him at the desk he'd cleared for the purpose and read through the 47 pages in 45 minutes, which was fast but not careless. He watched her eyes moving and knew she wasn't skimming. When she finished, she set the file down and was quiet for a moment. The block grant diversion, she said. That's the money that was supposed to fund the intake coordinator position for 3 years. The one they told us was cut due to budget constraints. Yes. It wasn't cut. It was redirected. Through a contract with a company called Meridian Community Partners, which is a Delaware LLC with 2 principals who are connected to real estate development projects that received city approval in 2022 and 2023. She looked at him. And you've had this for how long? 2 days. Before that, pieces of it for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Her voice was flat, not angry exactly, but close to something that would become anger once she had time to process it. You've been sitting on this for 6 weeks. I was building the complete picture. Partial information is a weapon that can misfire. She started to say something, stopped, and looked at the file again. He could see her working through it, the anger, the calculation of what this meant, the professional instinct to figure out the next move before letting herself feel the thing fully. He recognized that sequence. He'd been running it himself for 2 days. "The grant window," she said. 8 weeks. Give or take. That's not a lot of runway. "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet again, then, "What do you want to do with this?" "That depends partly on you. It's your program, and it's going to be your face on the public hearing if it gets that far." She looked at him sharply. "Public hearing?" "The grant process includes a public comment period. It's being managed by the same deputy director whose name is in that file. If we request an emergency public hearing and bring this documentation forward in that context, in a public meeting of record, with press present, it becomes significantly harder to suppress than a complaint filed through administrative channels." She understood immediately. Because anything filed administratively goes right back into the system that's already compromised. "Right." She sat back. He could see her thinking, and he let her think without filling the silence. This was her territory in ways it wasn't his. She knew the community, knew the council dynamics, knew which reporters at the local paper would understand what they were looking at. He had the documentation and the financial expertise to present it clearly. She had everything else. "There's a hearing scheduled," she said slowly, "for the grant cycle review, 4 weeks from now. The deputy director chairs it, but it's open to public testimony." "I know. You want to present this there. I want you to present it. I'll be there. I'll be on record. But your program is the point of the story, and you should be the one telling it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to be very visible." "I know. That's what you've been avoiding." "I know that too." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. She'd figured out something about him that she was reordering her previous understanding around. "Does Isla know any of this?" she asked. "No." "Are you going to tell her?" He was quiet. "I'm going to tell her everything," he said. "I just need to get the sequence right." Natalie looked at him for another moment, then looked away. "Okay," she said. "Let's build the presentation." They worked for 3 hours at his desk, Natalie pulling case data from her laptop, and Grayson mapping the financial documentation into a sequence that told the story clearly enough that anyone watching it unfold couldn't misread what they were seeing. They were not a natural team. Their instincts ran in different directions, Natalie toward the human stories, and Grayson toward the structural evidence, and they had 2 actual arguments in those 3 hours, neither of which either of them fully won. But by the time she left at 1 o'clock, they had something that worked. Not polished, not clean, but true in a way that mattered. He told Isla the following Thursday. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. He told her his full name first, which felt, absurdly, like the hardest part. He said it plainly, without preamble. "My last name is Hale. Grayson Hale." He told her he'd been in private equity, that he'd left a public role in policy work about 2 years ago, that he had a foundation that funded community programs, that he'd been sitting at that noodle shop trying to be a person without a biography for a while, and that she deserved to know the actual version of who she'd been having Thursday dinners with for 5 months. She listened without interrupting. Her face did several things in sequence. Surprise, reassessment, something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, and then a long pause in which she looked at the table and didn't say anything. Then she said, "I Googled you." He blinked. "When?" "January. I Googled Grayson, private equity, Asheville, and got 3 results, none of which were you specifically, and I thought, okay, he's private, he has reasons, it's not my business." She paused. "I should have used the last name." "You didn't know the last name." "I know." She was quiet for another moment. "Grayson Hale." She said it like she was testing the weight of it. "You wrote the Hendricks Callaway Housing Framework." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I wrote a 20-page analysis of it in my second year of my master's program." She held his gaze, and there was something in her expression he couldn't quite read. Too many things layered over each other. It was the most structurally sound federal housing document published in that decade. My advisor used it as a case study. The silence between them was a specific kind of dense. Outside, a car passed. Ethan was at a friend's house for the first time in months, a small social breakthrough his teacher had texted about with 3 exclamation points. And for once, it was just the two of them at the corner table. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I was—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I was afraid it would change how you looked at me. And I'd gotten used to the way you looked at me." She was quiet for a long time. He didn't try to fill it. "It does change things," she finally said. "Not all of them, but some of them." She looked up. "I need to think about that." "Okay. I'm not walking away from this." She gestured between them, at the table, at the restaurant, at whatever shape the word this contained. "I just need to think about it." "Okay," he said again. They sat together for another hour, not talking much, and then she said goodnight and walked to the bus stop, and he sat at the empty table for a while in the way he'd sat the very first night, 6 months ago, watching the space where she'd been. The hearing was 3.5 weeks away. He had a 47-page document, a co-presenter who was sharper than anyone in that council chamber expected, and a name he'd been keeping out of rooms for 2 years that was about to be very much back in one. He also had a woman who'd said, "I need to think about it," which was not a no, but which kept him awake until 2 in the morning replaying the exact tone in which she'd said it, and finding no definitive conclusion. The next 10 days were the hardest of the process, not because of the hearing preparation. That was difficult but tractable, the kind of hard work that at least moved in a direction, but because of the waiting. Grayson and Natalie refined the presentation. Marcus provided 2 additional documents that arrived on a Tuesday and closed the last gap in the financial chain. Natalie made calls to a reporter at the Asheville Tribune she trusted, not to leak anything, but to ensure that someone who understood public funding would be in the room when it mattered. Grayson drafted a legal summary with his attorney on a Wednesday call that lasted 2 hours and ended with his attorney saying, "This is watertight, Grayson, but you understand what happens after you present it." And Grayson saying yes, he understood. Isla texted him on a Thursday. Not their dinner, just a text, mid-morning, which was the first time she'd ever done that. It said, "Still thinking. That's not a bad thing." He read it 4 times, then wrote back, "Take your time." He stared at that for a moment, then added, "Thursday still on?" Her reply came 11 minutes later. "Yes, obviously." He put his phone down and felt something unclench in his chest that had been clenched for 10 days. She came to dinner that Thursday with her notebook and a library book and the canvas bag, same as always. Ethan showed her an updated version of his map. He'd been refining it for weeks now, adding details, correcting the compass rose, naming streets that he made up himself with calm confidence. The map had grown to 2 sheets of paper taped together. At its center was still the same thing it had always been, the thing he'd put there the very first time. A small square with 4 walls and a triangle roof and the word home written carefully in blue crayon. "It's getting very detailed," Isla told him. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not finished yet." "What else is it missing?" He thought about it with his characteristic seriousness. "The dog," he said. "I keep forgetting to put in the dog." She handed the map back to him. "That seems like an important thing to get right." "It is," he agreed and bent back over his work. Grayson watched the 2 of them across the table and thought, this is the thing worth protecting. Not the document, not the hearing, not the vindication of a policy argument. This. The specific ordinary weight of a Thursday evening, of soup going slightly cold while a child draws a map of somewhere he wants to go, of a woman who'd been afraid to ask for a meal now sitting at a table like she belonged there, because she did. He was still afraid. Not of the hearing. He'd been in enough high-pressure rooms to know he could manage it. He was afraid of the part after, of what happened when the noise settled and there was nothing left to do but figure out what all of it meant, and whether the things that had grown in the quiet of 5 Thursday evenings were sturdy enough to survive being looked at directly. He didn't have the answer to that yet. The hearing was 12 days away, and the city didn't know what was coming, and Grayson Hale, who had spent 2 years trying to be just Grayson, just a man, just a father eating noodles on a cold sidewalk, was about to stop being invisible. He picked up his soup spoon and looked at Ethan's map and said nothing, because sometimes there's nothing to say. And sitting in the middle of a thing, right in the center of it, is the only honest response. He sat in the center of it. Outside, the string lights swayed in an early spring wind, and the mountains held their position on the horizon the way they always did, and the city went on around all of them, full of its ordinary complications and its quiet corruptions and its people trying to get somewhere warmer than where they'd been. The hearing was 12 days away. The 12 days passed the way the days before significant things always pass. Too fast in the hours when there was work to do, and too slow in the hours when there wasn't. Grayson spent most of them at his desk. The presentation had been refined to the point where refining it further would only introduce doubt, so he stopped refining and started rehearsing. Not with notes, not with slides, but by sitting in his office chair and talking through the financial chain out loud, the way he used to prepare for congressional testimony a decade ago. He needed to be able to explain it without the documents in front of him, in plain language, in the time it took a council member's attention to wander and come back. The documents were for the record. The explanation was for the room. Natalie was preparing differently. She was talking to people. Her caseload gave her access to a cross-section of Asheville that no policy paper could replicate, and she spent the 12 days quietly, carefully making sure that the right people knew the hearing was happening and that their presence would matter. Not organizing exactly. She was cautious about the line between mobilizing community support and creating something that could be dismissed as a political performance. What she was doing was closer to reminding people that a public hearing was public, that testimony from people directly affected by the program gap carried legal weight in the grant review process, that showing up was a form of evidence. She was good at this in a way that Grayson wasn't. He knew systems. She knew people inside systems, which was a different and in many ways harder thing to know. They met twice in the 12 days, once at his office and once at a coffee shop on Broadway that was neutral ground and therefore felt slightly like a war room. Both meetings were productive and slightly tense in the way that collaboration between two people with strong and different instincts is always tense. She pushed back on the order of the financial presentation. He pushed back on the length of the personal testimony section. They compromised, which meant both of them were slightly dissatisfied with the result, which in Grayson's experience usually meant the result was about right. Isla came to the Thursday dinner 4 days before the hearing with the expression he'd learned to read as her working through something she hadn't finished working through yet. She sat down, ordered without looking at the menu. She always got the number 7 now, same as him, and waited until Ethan had finished telling her about a situation at school involving a disputed handball rule before she said quietly, "Tell me what's happening with the hearing." He looked at her. "How much do you know?" "Natalie told me there's a public hearing. She told me Safe Harbor is in the middle of it. She didn't tell me the rest." She held his gaze steadily. "I want the rest." Ethan had moved on to his map, pencil moving in concentrated silence, tactfully or obliviously removed from the adult conversation. With Ethan, it was sometimes hard to tell which. Grayson told her. All of it this time. The 47 pages, the shell companies, the redirected block grant money, the deputy director, the 3 council members, the specific mechanism by which Safe Harbor's grant review was being extended until the funding window closed. He told her in plain terms, without softening it or over-explaining it, the way he'd learned she preferred to receive difficult information. She listened without interrupting. Her soup sat mostly untouched. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long has this been going on?" "At least 4 years, possibly longer." "So the whole time I was—" She stopped. Something crossed her face, not grief exactly, but close to it. The particular expression of someone recalculating the past with new information and finding the new version harder to sit with than the old one. "When I lost my housing, I applied for an emergency rental assistance program. It was a county program. I was told the funds were exhausted." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. "Were they?" she asked. "Actually exhausted?" He held her gaze. "I don't know specifically, but the program you're describing draws from the same grant pool as Safe Harbor, and the pattern I found—" He paused. "It's consistent." She looked at the table. A muscle in her jaw moved. "Isla." "I'm fine," she said, in the tone that meant she was processing something that would take longer than this dinner to fully land. "You don't have to be fine right now." "I know." She picked up her spoon, set it down again. "I'm angry. I'm allowed to be angry, right? That's a reasonable response to this." It's the only reasonable response to this. She nodded once, slow, then she looked up. What can I do? He hadn't expected that. Or maybe he had, and just hadn't let himself count on it. The hearing has a public testimony section. People who've been directly affected by the service gaps carry weight in the grant review record. She understood immediately. You want me to testify? I want you to consider it. It would mean talking publicly about things you've worked hard to keep private. I won't push you on it. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan's pencil moved across his map with small scratching sounds. Outside, the March wind pushed a paper cup down the sidewalk. What kind of weight? She said. Specifically, you said it carries weight. How much? In a grant review that's being challenged on procedural grounds, first-hand testimony about denied access to services creates a legal record that the review board is required to consider. It doesn't guarantee the outcome, but it makes the record of the hearing harder to bury. She nodded slowly. He could see her working through it, the cost of it, the privacy of it, the specific exposure of standing in a public room and saying out loud what had happened to her and why. Let me think about it, she said. Take the time. She almost smiled. That's what you said when I told you I needed to think about you. It's a good answer. It's a deflection. It's also a good answer, he said. She looked at him for a moment, the real, steady look she'd been giving him since early winter, the one that still undid something in him that he hadn't managed to put back the way it was. And then she picked up her spoon and started eating. And the conversation moved, and Ethan showed them both the latest version of the map, which now had streets named and a small square for the house, and beside it, finally, a small four-legged shape in brown crayon. You put in the dog, Isla said. Medium-sized, Ethan confirmed. Not too big, not too small. You finally got it right. I know, he said, with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something important. Grayson looked at the map for a long time that night, at the brown crayon dog and the blue crayon house and the word at the center written in careful first-grade letters. He looked at it and felt the weight of the 12 days left and the weeks and months that would follow, regardless of how the hearing went, and the fact that none of it, not the hearing, not the documentation, not the program or the grant or the council members or any of it, was actually the thing he was most afraid of losing. He was most afraid of losing the Thursday table, the ordinary weight of it. He'd had large things before, large professional victories, large public moments, and they'd all eventually settled into the ordinary dimensions of a life. What he had at this corner table was already ordinary, already small in the way of things that actually matter, and he was terrified in the specific way of someone who has found something real and knows exactly how real things can be taken away. He drove home that night with Ethan asleep in the back seat and thought, don't let the next 2 weeks make you forget what you're doing this for. He didn't let himself forget. The morning of the hearing arrived on a Tuesday in mid-April, cold and clear, the sky over the mountains a hard, bright blue. Grayson wore a suit for the first time in almost 2 years, not because he thought it would help him specifically, but because he understood what it signaled in a room like this, and he'd always believed in being clear about what you were bringing to a table. Natalie wore her good blazer over a plain shirt. They arrived at City Hall 40 minutes early and sat in the hallway outside the hearing chamber and went through the presentation one final time without saying much to each other. There were more people in the hallway than either of them had expected. Natalie had done her quiet work well. There were perhaps 30 people seated along the corridor benches by the time the chamber doors opened, a range of faces and ages that told the story of the service gap more effectively than any document could. 3 of them Grayson recognized from Natalie's case descriptions. One was a woman in her late 50s with a slight tremor in her hands who had been on the transitional housing waiting list for 7 months. One was a young man who'd aged out of foster care at 18 and spent the following year navigating an intake system so fragmented that he'd given up and slept in his car for 3 months before someone at a church referral had steered him toward Natalie's office. One was a middle-aged man who'd lost his job during the previous winter and found, in attempting to access emergency food assistance, that the county intake process required documentation he didn't have for reasons the intake worker hadn't explained and he hadn't known to ask about. They were not a movement. They were just people who had shown up because Natalie had called them and told them the truth. That what happened in this room today would determine whether a program existed that might actually work for people like them, and that their being here was part of the evidence. Grayson looked down the corridor at them and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for days. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter than that. A sense of proportion. He'd been inside this kind of room before, carrying this kind of documentation, and he knew that rooms and documentation didn't always produce the right result. But the people in the hallway were real in a way that was harder to dismiss than a financial report, and he was going to make sure the room understood that. The chamber filled in the 20 minutes before the hearing began. The press section had 4 reporters, which was more than Natalie had hoped for, and included the Tribune reporter she'd briefed, and a journalist from a regional NPR affiliate who had apparently received a tip Natalie claimed not to have made. The council table had 7 members, 3 of whom Grayson knew by name and reputation, and whose expressions, as they settled into their seats and registered the size of the audience, showed the particular controlled discomfort of people who had expected a procedural meeting and were recalibrating. Deputy Director Warren Holt sat at the administrative table to the right of the council. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a quality of practiced blandness that Grayson recognized immediately, the civil servant version of camouflage. He had a folder in front of him and a styrofoam cup of coffee and the expression of someone who managed things for a living and expected to manage this. He hadn't seen the 47 pages yet. He didn't know they existed. Grayson had made very sure of that. The hearing chair, Councilwoman Patricia Reyes, who was not one of the 3, and whose reputation for procedural exactness Grayson had verified before today, opened the session at 9 o'clock precisely. She announced the agenda. A review of the current Community Development Block grant cycle, with specific consideration of the Safe Harbor Program proposal submitted by Natalie Brooks of the Buncombe County Community Services Office. She gave the floor to Natalie first. Natalie stood and talked for 11 minutes. She didn't read from notes. She knew this material the way she knew the layout of her own office, completely, without having to think about where anything was. She described Safe Harbor's structure clearly and without jargon. She described the service gap it was designed to address with specificity, citing case types from her 6 years of direct work. She did not make emotional appeals. She made a case, which was more effective. When she sat down, Councilwoman Reyes opened the floor for administrative response. Holt picked up his folder. He spoke for 8 minutes about review process, about due diligence requirements for grant proposals of this scope, about the standard timeline for comprehensive programmatic assessment. He was smooth and unhurried. He used the word robust 4 times. He gave no specific reason for the extended review timeline beyond a general reference to thoroughness. Grayson watched 3 of the council members nod slightly while Holt spoke. He noted which 3. Then Reyes opened the public testimony section, and the people from the hallway came forward one at a time. The woman with the tremor in her hand spoke for 4 minutes about the 7-month waiting list. The young man who'd slept in his car spoke for 3 minutes in a voice that was steady in a way that clearly cost him something. 3 others followed, each specific, each without drama, each carrying the simple and devastating clarity of a person describing something that actually happened to them. The council was quiet in a way that was different from its usual official quiet. Then Reyes called Grayson's name. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the podium and set down a folder he didn't open and looked at the room. The council table, the press section, the packed public gallery, the administrative table where Holt was sitting with his styrofoam cup and his practiced blandness. And he began. He started with the grant structure. He explained in 2 minutes of clean financial language how community development block grants were allocated, tracked, and audited at the federal level, and what the reporting requirements were at the municipal level. He saw 2 council members lean forward slightly. He saw one of the 3 lean back. Then he described what he'd found. He didn't call it corruption at first. He called it a pattern of contract awards to entities whose stated community benefit function did not correspond to their actual operational activity, a pattern of grant fund transfers that moved through 2 or 3 intermediate contracts before reaching final recipients who were not the intended beneficiaries of the original federal allocation, a pattern of grant review extensions that consistently coincided with the closing of federal funding windows, effectively killing proposals without requiring a formal vote against them. He described the pattern for 4 minutes. Then he opened the folder and said, "I'd like to submit to the record documentation that substantiates this pattern." And he passed a copy to Councilwoman Reyes, a copy to the clerk, and a copy to the press table. The room changed. It didn't change loudly. There was no gasp, no dramatic moment. What happened was subtler. A shift in the quality of attention, like a room full of people who had been watching one thing, suddenly understanding they were watching something else entirely. The Tribune reporter flipped immediately to the financial summary page. The NPR journalist leaned over to look. 2 council members began reading with the focused attention of people trying to figure out what they'd just been handed. Holt's blandness held for approximately 30 seconds. Then something behind it cracked, not dramatically, but visibly. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the hands that had been casually loose before. Grayson continued. He named the specific contracts. He named Meridian Community Partners. He described the financial flows in the kind of plain language he'd spent 12 days calibrating. He did not name the council members. He named the contracts they'd approved. He let the room draw the line. It took about 45 seconds. Councilwoman Reyes stopped him. Not to shut him down, he could read the difference, but to ask a procedural question, whether the documentation he'd submitted was available in full to all council members. It was. She called a 10-minute recess. The 10 minutes lasted 22. When the council returned, 2 of the 3 had expressions that had moved from controlled discomfort to something closer to visible damage management. The third, a man named Alderman Price, who had approved 5 of the 9 contracts in the documentation, was speaking quietly and urgently to the council's legal counsel in the corner. Grayson stood by the window during the recess, and Natalie stood beside him, and neither of them said anything. She had her arms crossed and was looking at the floor. He could see her controlling something. Relief, maybe, or the adrenaline come down of a very high-stakes presentation that had landed the way it was supposed to. Those 2 things felt similar, and both of them took a minute. "You did well," he said quietly. "So did you." She didn't look up. Price is going to try to table the full discussion. "He doesn't have the votes. Not with Reyes chairing and the press in the room." "You sure?" "No," he said honestly. "But I think so." She nodded. "Good enough." When the session resumed, Reyes made 3 motions in sequence. She moved to enter Grayson's full documentation into the hearing record. She moved to suspend the extended review period for the Safe Harbor grant proposal pending an independent audit of the CDBG fund allocation for the previous 4 fiscal years, and she moved to forward the documentation to the State Comptroller's Office for preliminary review. The votes were 5-2. Price and a council member named Alderman Cosgrove voted against all 3. Their votes were recorded. So was everything else. The hearing ended at 12:40. The chamber emptied in the noise of something significant that nobody quite knew how to characterize yet. A beginning, maybe, or the end of something that had been running quietly for too long, or both at the same time, which is usually how things are. Natalie was surrounded almost immediately by the people from the hallway who wanted to understand what they'd just watched, and whether it meant what they thought it meant. She handled it with the patient, specific directness she brought to everything. Yes, this was significant. No, it wasn't resolved. Yes, there was a process ahead. Yes, the program was still in motion. She answered every question twice if it needed answering twice. Grayson stood to the side. The Tribune reporter found him within 3 minutes, which was faster than he'd expected. Her name was Casey, and she had the focused, slightly aggressive efficiency of someone who'd been in enough rooms to know when something was real, and when it was theater, and had no patience for the latter. "Grayson Hale," she said, "former Hendricks Calloway, 2-year absence from public life. You want to give me a statement?" "I want to give you background," he said. "On the record later if it comes to that. Off the record for now." "Fair enough. Where have you been for 2 years?" "Asheville," he said. "Just quieter." She looked at him with the appraising look of someone deciding whether there was more story here or whether this was its own story. He could see her deciding the latter, which was accurate. "The documentation is solid," she said. My financial consultant and my attorney both reviewed it. It's solid. The state comptroller referral. What's the realistic timeline? 4 to 6 weeks for a preliminary assessment. Could trigger a full audit within 3 months. She was typing notes on her phone. And the Safe Harbor grant? The pilot program? The independent audit suspends the extended review, which means the grant decision has to be made within the standard timeline, 30 days, which brings it inside the funding window. Yes. She looked at him. You did this on purpose, the timing. I did the math, he said. Casey half smiled, the kind that acknowledges a competent move without quite approving of it. I'll want an on-the-record interview eventually. I know, call my office. He gave her a card, which he'd had made specifically for today, because he'd known this moment was coming and had decided to meet it rather than manage it. She took the card and moved on. He stood for a moment in the clearing space of the chamber, where the gallery was emptying and the council staff were collecting documents, and Price was still in a corner with the legal counsel, and everything that had been in motion for months was now in a different kind of motion, one with more visible consequences. His phone buzzed. A text from Ethan's school. His son had won something called the Spring Art Competition with a piece his teacher described as an incredibly detailed hand-drawn map. Grayson looked at this message for a long moment and felt something move through him that he couldn't name cleanly. Some combination of pride and tenderness and the specific joy of a moment arriving that you'd been hoping for without quite daring to. He texted back a thumbs up and 4 exclamation points, which was more punctuation than he normally used, but the moment seemed to require it. Then he texted Isla. He kept it short. It went well. Talk tonight? Her reply came in under a minute. I watched. The NPR stream. You were very calm. He stared at that. Then, you watched? Natalie sent me the link this morning. A pause. Then, you should have been more nervous. It would have been more relatable. He laughed. Standing in a mostly empty City Hall chamber with a reporter's card in his hand and 2 years of voluntary anonymity officially over, he laughed at his phone like a man who'd forgotten he was capable of that particular involuntary response. I was nervous, he typed back. I hit it. I know, she wrote. I could tell. Your jaw. He didn't know what to do with the fact that she knew his jaw well enough to read it on a low-resolution NPR live stream. He pocketed his phone and went to find Natalie. She was finally free of the hallway group and was standing near the main exit with her blazer slightly rumpled and her hair coming loose from where she'd pinned it that morning. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been running on intensity for weeks and has just used the last of it. The audit motion, she said when he reached her. That was Reyes's own idea. I didn't plan for that. I know. It was the right call. If the audit finds what I think it's going to find, it'll find it, he said. The documentation is there. She nodded slowly. They walked out of City Hall together into the April afternoon, which was warmer than the morning had been, the sun having decided midway through the day to commit to itself. The steps were busy with people who'd been in other hearings, other business, ordinary Tuesday transactions with city government, none of whom knew what had just happened in Chamber 4. 30 days, Natalie said. 30 days, he confirmed. That's a long 30 days. Everything important takes a long 30 days. She looked at him sideways. You're going to be okay. With the public thing, being visible again. It wasn't quite a question. He considered it anyway. I don't know yet, he said. I've been okay in this room. Ask me again in a month. She seemed to respect that answer. They stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment, the city moving around them, and then she said, Go see her, which was not something either of them had discussed, but was clearly what she thought he should do. She's at work, he said. The nursery closes at 3. He looked at her. How do you know that? I know a lot of things, Natalie said, with the air of someone who has been compiling information about people for so long, it's just how she experiences the world. Go. He went. The nursery was on the edge of town where the commercial strip gave way to a longer road with more sky above it. He parked in the small lot and went in through the gate, which opened onto rows of early spring plants, the cold weather varieties that could take April in the mountains, pansies and early herbs, and neat rows of seedlings in black plastic trays. There was the smell of soil and water and something green and alive. He found Isla at the far end of the greenhouse, restacking clay pots with the particular muscle memory efficiency of someone who's done a task so many times they don't have to think about it. She looked up when she heard him, registered his suit, registered that he had come here instead of waiting until tonight. "That's a lot of effort for a pot-stacking audience," she said. "I had a hearing." "I know. I watched." She set down the pot she was holding. "You held your hands very still the whole time. That's what tells me you were nervous, not your jaw." "I made that up." He stood in the greenhouse doorway and looked at her. "Why did you make it up?" "Because I wanted you to know I was watching closely enough to notice if you weren't." She held his gaze. "And because I wanted to see what you did with that information." He was quiet for a moment. "What did I do with it?" "You laughed," she said. "I don't know if you realize how rarely you do that." He didn't have a good response to that. He stepped into the greenhouse, and the smell of soil settled around him, and the afternoon light came through the plastic panels overhead in the particular flat way of greenhouse light, making everything slightly golden and slightly unreal. "The program might actually happen," he said. 30 days. "I know." She picked up another pot, turned it in her hands. "And the audit? Months. Longer for any formal accountability, if it gets there." He paused. "These things move slowly." "I know that too." She looked at the pot. "I called Dr. Pierce yesterday. My advisor." He waited. "There's a returning student grant cycle that opens in May. She thinks my research profile is strong enough to qualify. She already submitted a letter of support." Isla set the pot down carefully. "I didn't ask her to. She just did it." "She's been waiting for you to come back," he said. "That's what she said." A pause. "She said the work was worth finishing. She said that's not a compliment she gives everyone." "It isn't," he said. "I've read your research area, the watershed management methodology you were using. It's specific and it's solid. She knows what she has." Isla looked at him then with the full version of the look he'd been learning all winter, the one that went past the surface and required you to actually be there to receive it. "You read my research area. You mentioned the thesis topic in December. I was curious." "You were curious," she repeated in a tone that understood what it meant when Grayson Hale was curious about something. "Yes," he said simply. She was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the greenhouse was warm and still, the plastic panels flexing slightly in a wind they couldn't feel, the smell of soil and water and green things doing what they do in spring. "I thought about what you said," she said, "about being afraid the information would change how I looked at you." "And? It did change it," she said, "but not the way you were afraid of." She paused, choosing the words carefully, because she was someone who chose words carefully when they mattered. "I've been looked at by people with money before. People who helped me and wanted me to feel smaller for needing it. People who gave things so they could keep count." She looked at him. "That's not what you did. That's not what any of this was." He didn't say anything. "You sat across a table from me for 5 months, and you were just you," she said, "and I got to figure out who you were at the same rate you were figuring out who I still was. That was—" She stopped. "That mattered. A lot." The afternoon light came through the panels, and the pots sat in their rows, and somewhere outside a car passed on the long road with more sky above it. And Grayson Hale stood in a greenhouse in April with the woman who'd once been afraid to ask for a bowl of soup and felt, in a way that was not dramatic and not perfect, and not anything like what love looks like in the version people plan for, exactly where he was supposed to be. "I know I haven't made this easy," he said. "Neither have I." "You really haven't," he agreed. She almost smiled. "Don't push it." He didn't push it. He stayed in the greenhouse until she finished the pots, and then they walked out together into the late afternoon, and the mountains were there on the horizon the way they always were. And the 30 days were ahead of them, and the months after that, and none of it was resolved yet, and none of it was simple, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that was enough for now, which is usually how the things that last actually begin. The 30 days did not pass cleanly. Nothing important ever does, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either selling something or remembering wrong. The 30 days passed the way significant waiting periods always pass, in chunks, some of them manageable and some of them not, with good news arriving in the same week as complications, and the whole thing requiring more patience than either Grayson or Natalie had budgeted for when they'd walked out of City Hall into that April afternoon feeling, briefly, like the hard part was over. The hard part was not over. It was just different now. The state comptroller's office acknowledged receipt of the documentation within the first week, which was faster than Grayson had expected and slower than Natalie had hoped, which put them roughly where they'd been before in terms of mutual dissatisfaction with the pace. A preliminary inquiry was opened. That was the language used. Preliminary inquiry, which was bureaucratic for, we are looking at this, but we are not yet committed to finding anything, and both of them knew it. Alderman Price resigned from the council on day 11. He announced it in a statement that cited personal reasons and the desire to spend more time with his family, which was the standard language for a man who had seen what was coming and decided to get ahead of it. His resignation was reported in the Tribune with a sidebar that connected it to the ongoing audit inquiry, without quite stating the connection directly, which was the kind of careful journalism that Casey did well. 2 days after that, Warren Holt, the deputy director, was placed on administrative leave while the internal county review proceeded. His styrofoam cup and his folder and his practiced blandness were no longer present at any official meetings, which changed the texture of those rooms in ways people who had sat in them regularly would describe later as a relief they hadn't known they were waiting for. The third council member, Alderman Cosgrove, did not resign. He hired a lawyer and said nothing publicly, which was tactically sound and personally revealing in equal measure. The independent audit of the CDBG fund allocation began on day 14. It was conducted by a firm out of Charlotte that had done similar work in 3 other North Carolina counties, and its lead auditor was a woman named Sheila Tran, who had, by all available accounts, never found a set of municipal books she couldn't read completely. Grayson knew her by reputation. He'd provided the 47 pages to her office directly, as part of the hearing record, and she'd called him once, a 12-minute conversation, mostly her asking specific questions about the financial chain and him answering them, and at the end she'd said, "This is well documented," in the tone of someone who encounters well-documented things less often than she should. "We did our homework," he'd said. "Most people don't," she'd said, and hung up. The Safe Harbor grant decision came on day 28, 2 days before the deadline. Natalie was in her office when the email arrived. She read it twice, very fast, then once more slowly. Then she sat back in her chair and did not allow herself to cry, which took about 30 seconds of active work. And then she called Grayson. "It's approved," she said. "Pilot program, 12-month funding cycle, full intake coordinator position included." There was a silence on his end. Not long, just a breath. "Natalie, I know. I know," she said again, because she didn't want either of them to say something that would make it smaller than it was or larger than it was, and the only safe territory was those 2 words, repeated, carrying whatever weight was needed. They stayed on the phone for another minute without saying much, and then she had 4 other calls to make, and he let her go. She called Isla third, after her supervisor, and before the Tribune reporter. Isla was between shifts at the nursery when her phone rang, standing in the parking lot in the April sun with soil on her gloves and her hair coming loose from its tie, and she listened to Natalie's voice and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for, something that lived in the neighborhood of relief, but was larger than relief, more complex, with grief mixed into it because you can't be told that something that should have existed years ago is finally going to exist without feeling both things simultaneously. "It's happening," Natalie said. "Yeah," Isla said. She pulled off one of her gloves. The sun was warm on the back of her hand. "Yeah, it is." She stood in the parking lot for a few minutes after the call ended, not moving, just holding her phone and looking at the mountains on the horizon, and thinking about the night she'd stood at the edge of a sidewalk on Lexington Avenue and done the math on a chalkboard menu and found she came up short. She thought about the bowl of soup that appeared in front of her without her asking for it, and how she'd sat down because she was too tired to maintain the pride of standing. She thought about how much had changed in 7 months, and she thought about how much hadn't, how she was still the same person who'd stood at that sidewalk edge, still carried the same fears in the same places, still woke at 3 in the morning sometimes with the specific dread of someone whose floor had dropped out before and who couldn't fully trust that it was solid now. That hadn't gone away. She wasn't sure it ever fully went away once you'd learned it could happen. But the floor was there. That was something. That was actually quite a lot. She put her glove back on and went back to work. The May returning student grant cycle opened on the 1st of the month, as Dr. Pierce had said it would. Isla submitted her application on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table of the studio apartment that she'd been calling home for 6 months. Not with enthusiasm exactly, because the application process for anything that mattered was too fraught for enthusiasm, but with a kind of deliberate steadiness. She filled in the forms accurately. She attached the research portfolio Dr. Pierce had helped her compile. She wrote the required personal statement in 3 drafts, the first of which was too careful, and the second of which overcorrected into something that sounded like a motivational poster, and the third of which was just true. What she'd been studying, what had interrupted it, what she understood now that she hadn't then, what she intended to do with the degree when she finished it. She didn't ask Grayson to read it. She'd thought about it, had almost texted him the document twice, and had stopped herself both times. Not because she didn't trust his judgment, she did more than she trusted most people's, but because this one needed to be entirely hers. He would have made it better, and she needed to live with the version that came from her, whatever it was worth. She submitted it at 6:14 on a Sunday evening, closed her laptop, and went to make dinner, which was pasta because it was Sunday and she was tired and pasta required nothing from her. She told Grayson about the submission at Thursday dinner, which had continued unchanged through all of it, through the hearing and the audit and the grant approval and Price's resignation and Holt's administrative leave. The Thursday dinners had a kind of structural integrity that none of the upheaval had touched, and she'd noticed that about them, noticed that they were the one fixed thing in a period of significant unfixedness. And the noticing had told her something she hadn't known how to say directly yet. "I submitted on Sunday," she said. "How do you feel about it?" "Like I wrote the best version of it I was capable of writing," she said. "Which means if it's not enough, it's genuinely not enough. And that's useful to know. And if it is enough," she looked at the table. "I haven't let myself think about that part yet." "That's probably right," he said. "Think about it when it's real." "That's what I've been doing all year," she said, "thinking about things when they're real instead of in advance." "Is it working?" She considered that seriously. "Better than the other way," she said. "The other way I just scared myself out of things before they had a chance to happen." Ethan was listening to this with one ear while ostensibly focused on his drawing, which was the latest version of the map. It had grown to 4 sheets of paper now, taped together at the edges, and included a neighborhood around the central house, with named streets and nearby features, and the medium-sized dog rendered with more anatomical confidence than in previous versions. "It's getting very big," Isla told him. "Maps have to be accurate," he said. "You can't leave things out." "What are you going to do with it when it's done?" He looked up at her with an expression that suggested this was a question he'd already thought about extensively. "Frame it," he said, "and put it on the wall. In the house." "Which house?" "The one on the map," he said, with the calm certainty of a 7-year-old who has already decided how things are going to go and doesn't see the need to discuss it further. Grayson looked at his son and then looked at Isla and found her already looking at him, which was a thing that happened more often now, but the simultaneous look, both of them arriving at the same moment from different directions. She held his gaze for a second and then looked back at Ethan's map, which was spread across half the table and still technically in progress, still missing details that Ethan hadn't gotten to yet. Still being made. That was the phrase that stayed with Grayson afterward, driving home with Ethan asleep in the back seat the way he always was on Thursday nights. Still being made. That was the most honest description of everything. The program, the audit, the application, whatever was growing between him and Isla. His own slow reemergence into a public life that he was learning to participate in without letting it consume him the way it had before. None of it finished. All of it in process. That was not a comfortable state, and he'd spent most of his adult life trying to move things to completion as efficiently as possible because completion felt safer than the middle of things. He was learning to be in the middle of things. Ethan helped with that. had always helped with that, because children live entirely in the present tense and drag you there with them whether you want to go or not. June came, and with it, summer settling over the mountains with less drama than the seasons before it. The audit report arrived in the first week. Preliminary, not final, but substantial. Sheila Tran's firm had reconstructed the full financial chain, and the numbers were, as Marcus had said, airtight. The diversion of public funds was documented across 4 fiscal years, with the total amount redirected from community services programs coming to just over $2.3 million. It was not an abstraction. It was a number with specificity and weight. And when it was reported in the Tribune and picked up by regional outlets, that specificity was what made it land. People understand $2 million better than they understand policy failure. It was a fact of public attention that Grayson had always found frustrating and had learned to work with. Alderman Cosgrove's lawyer negotiated a cooperation agreement with the County Ethics Board in the second week of June. The agreement required Cosgrove to provide testimony about the structure of the scheme in exchange for reduced personal liability, which meant the full picture of how it had operated, who had initiated it, how long it had been in place, what decisions had been made at what levels, was going to be on the record. Grayson's attorney called him with the news on a Tuesday morning, and he sat at his desk and felt not triumph, but something more like exhaustion, the specific fatigue of a problem that has finally been fully surfaced after months of existing underground. He called Natalie. She answered on the second ring. "I heard," she said. "It's not over. These processes take—" "I know how long they take," she said. "I've been in this system for 7 years." A pause. "But the record exists now. It can't be unmade." "No," he said. "It can't." "That's what matters," she said. "Not the speed. The permanence." He thought about that for a while after the call ended. The permanence. The record. The thing that could not be unmade. He'd spent 2 years believing that stepping back from the public machinery meant choosing permanence over noise. And he'd been right and also wrong in equal measure, because permanence sometimes required making noise, required stepping back into the room and putting your name on something, even when you'd grown to prefer the quiet. He didn't regret it. He'd been asking himself that question periodically since April, and the answer kept coming back the same way. No. He didn't regret it. He was having lunch at his desk when his phone rang and he saw it was Isla and answered immediately, because she almost never called midday. "I got an email," she said. He put down his fork. "From the graduate program's office?" Her voice was controlled in the way it got when she was managing something large. "The grant. The returning student grant." He waited. He did not say anything. He understood that this moment was hers and his job was to hold the space for it. "I got it," she said. He let out a breath. "Isla. Full funding, September enrollment." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, a small fracture in the controlled surface that she didn't try to hide. "I'm going back." He sat at his desk with his phone against his ear and looked at the wall, at nothing in particular, and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, a clean, uncomplicated gladness, the kind that doesn't require qualification or management, that exists entirely in the present moment without dragging the past into it or worrying about the future. He felt it for about 10 seconds. It was enough. "You were always going back," he said. "It just took the right path. You helped clear the path. Natalie helped. Your advisor helped. You cleared it." "Grayson." A pause. "Don't do that. Don't deflect. Just let it be something you were part of." He was quiet. Then, "Okay." "Okay," she said. And then, after a moment, she laughed, the real one, the one that still caught him off guard because of how it had started, that first December night in the snow when she'd produced it, and seemed surprised by herself. "I have to call Dr. Pierce, and then I have to go back to work because I'm in the parking lot and I've been on the phone too long." "Go," he said. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. She hung up, and he sat at his desk with his cold lunch and the news and the specific sound of her laugh still in the air of the room, and thought about October, about cold sidewalks and a woman who'd calculated the price of a bowl of soup and found herself short, about the distance between that night and this Tuesday in June when she called him from a parking lot to say she was going back to finish what she'd started. 7 months. Not very long in most measures. Long enough in others. Safe Harbor opened its doors on the first Monday of August, in a small office suite on Marymount Avenue that Natalie had found through a contact and negotiated into the program budget with her characteristic combination of patience and immovability. The suite had 2 intake rooms, a small waiting area with chairs that were actually comfortable, and a wall that Natalie had painted the previous Saturday with the help of 3 volunteers and several gallons of a warm yellow that she'd spent 20 minutes choosing because color mattered, she said, in a place where people were already carrying a lot. The first day was quiet. 6 people came through. Natalie processed each intake herself, sitting across from each person with her full attention and none of the bureaucratic exhaustion that turned help into a transaction. An intake coordinator had been hired, a young woman named Carmen who'd worked in community health for 3 years and understood both the case management side and the human side, which was the combination Natalie had spent weeks interviewing for. Grayson stopped by at noon briefly because Natalie had asked him to and because he wanted to see it. He stood in the doorway for a few minutes and looked at the waiting area with its comfortable chairs and the yellow wall and the door that was simply open, not behind a form or a waiting list, and thought about 47 pages of financial documentation and a Tuesday night 2 years ago when he'd stood at a podium in Washington and told a congressional subcommittee that the gap between policy intention and human outcome was the central failure of the system, and a man in the third row had nodded and written something down and nothing had changed at all. Something was changing. It was small and local and incomplete, and it would have setbacks he couldn't predict yet. But it was real, and it was built on something that hadn't come from the top down, which was the only kind of change that had any chance of sticking. He stayed for 12 minutes, said hello to Carmen, and left before Natalie could find someone for him to meet, because this was hers, and he was not going to accidentally make it about him by standing in it too long. Isla started her program in September. She was nervous in a way she hadn't been nervous since her first semester the first time. Not the performed confidence she'd sometimes used to manage fear, but genuine, unglamorous anxiety, the kind that lives in the stomach and doesn't respond to reassurance. She drove herself to campus the first morning, parked in the graduate student lot, and sat in her car for 4 minutes doing nothing in particular before she got out and went in. Dr. Pierce was waiting in her office, and stood up when Isla appeared in the doorway, which was not something Isla had expected, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Dr. Pierce said, "The watershed data held up. I want you to know that first." And Isla said, "Okay," and sat down, and they got to work. She told Grayson about those 4 minutes in the car at Thursday dinner that week. He'd asked how the first day was, and she'd said, "Fine," and then corrected herself. "I sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes beforehand because I was scared." 4 minutes isn't very long, he said. It felt long. "What happened after 4 minutes?" "I got out of the car," she said. "That's the whole thing," he said. "That's all it ever is." She looked at him. "Is that what it was like at the hearing, when you stood up?" He thought about it honestly. "I had approximately 30 seconds at the podium where I thought I'd made a significant mistake," he said. "Then I started talking and the 30 seconds ended. And after I felt like myself again, which I hadn't, fully, for about 2 years. She held his gaze. "I know that feeling," she said. "The coming back to yourself." "I know you do." Ethan had been listening, which he often did quietly and thoroughly. He looked up from his map, which had acquired a second level of detail in the past month. The house now surrounded by a street and neighboring houses and what appeared to be a small park with a bench, and said, "Are you scared about different things now than you used to be?" Both adults looked at him. "I heard you," he explained, without apology. "You were both scared before. Are you scared of different things now?" Grayson considered his son seriously, because Ethan's questions deserved serious consideration. "Yes," he said, "different things." "Me too," Ethan said, and went back to the map, apparently satisfied with this exchange. Isla looked at Grayson with an expression that was doing several things at once. He looked back at her with an expression that was probably doing several things at once as well, Neither of them had named it yet. They'd been circling it for months, since the greenhouse in April, since the text exchange after the hearing, since December in the snow when she'd said okay and meant something larger than the word. And the circling had its own honesty in it, the honesty of two people who'd both been hurt by rushing toward things and had silently agreed to take this one at the pace it needed. But the circling had to end somewhere. Things that are real require acknowledgement eventually. It ended not dramatically, not on a Thursday, not at the restaurant, but on a Saturday afternoon in late October, exactly 1 year after the night they'd first sat across from each other. When Grayson drove to the campus neighborhood where Isla was now living in a small apartment closer to the university, and they walked together through the neighborhood, and the trees were the same October color they'd been a year ago, and the mountain air had the same specific cold in it, and they were talking about something ordinary, something Ethan had said that week, or something Dr. Pierce had said. He couldn't remember later which. And they stopped at a corner to let a car pass, and when they stepped off the curb, she took his hand. Just that. No speech, no moment prepared for, no lines anyone had rehearsed. She just reached over and took his hand, and they kept walking. He held on. After a while, she said, "I was thinking about a year ago." "So was I," he said. "You ordered me a bowl of soup. You looked hungry." "I was hungry," she said. "I was also terrified and embarrassed and ready to walk away." "I know. Why didn't you just give me the leftovers? Why a new bowl?" He thought about it. He'd thought about it before in the abstract, but standing here with her hand in his on an October street, he thought about it more carefully. Because leftovers say, "I'm done with this. You can have the rest of it." And that wasn't... He paused. "That wasn't what I wanted to say." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you want to say?" "Sit down," he said. "You deserve a full bowl." She didn't say anything for half a block. Then she said quietly, "Yeah, that lands differently when I know you." "Different how?" "Because I know you meant it," she said. "Not as a gesture, not as charity. You just actually thought that." He looked ahead at the street. "I did." "You're a strange person," she said. But it wasn't a criticism. It was the kind of thing you say about someone whose strangeness you've come to need. He laughed. The involuntary kind, again. She smiled at the sound of it because she'd said something true about the laughing, and she knew it. They walked until the afternoon started going gray and cold, and then they found a coffee place and sat for another hour, and then he drove home, and she went back to her apartment and her research and her return to the version of herself that had been waiting patiently for the circumstances to become possible again. The months that followed had the quality of a life being properly assembled rather than frantically maintained. Isla's research moved faster than she'd expected once she had stable ground under her. Dr. Pierce confirmed in November that the thesis chapter she'd completed was the strongest work in the cohort, which Isla received with a flat look that meant she was overwhelmed and couldn't show it yet. Safe Harbor processed its 100th intake in January. The state audit of the CDBG funds resulted in February in the formal referral of Warren Holt and 2 Meridian Community Partners principals to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of misuse of public funds, a process that would take more months and possibly years because justice through institutional channels almost always did. But the referral was real, and the record was permanent, and that was what Natalie had said it would come down to. Grayson did 2 interviews in the fall, one with the Tribune, one with a policy journal that had been asking for a year, and found that public visibility, managed on his own terms and in his own time, was different from the version he'd left behind. He'd left behind a version that required him to be a narrative more than a person. What he was now was just someone who'd done something and was willing to talk about it, which was a much more manageable thing to be. He still ate at Faux Lien on Thursdays. Mrs. Nguyen still put in his order without being asked. Some things stabilize and become themselves and should be left exactly as they are. The wedding was in October, 14 months after the night Isla had taken his hand on a street corner, which, if you were counting, was 2 years to the month from the night she'd stood at the edge of a sidewalk and done the math on a chalkboard menu and found herself short. Grayson had asked her in June, on a Thursday, at the corner table, without a ring, because he'd asked her opinion on rings once, and she'd said she found them awkward and he believed in taking people at their word. He'd asked her plainly, The same way he did everything that mattered. I want to build the rest of this with you. I want it to be a decision we both make. She'd looked at him for a long moment. That's not exactly a proposal, she said. It's exactly a proposal, he said. It just doesn't have the standard delivery. You're going to drive me insane for the rest of my life, aren't you? Probably, he said. She'd said yes. The ceremony was small. Natalie was there in a dress she'd borrowed and complained about in equal measure. Doctor. Pierce came and sat in the second row with the contained satisfaction of a woman watching something she'd been invested in from a distance come to its right conclusion. Marcus flew in from Charlotte and spent most of the reception telling anyone who would listen about the financial documentation, which was his version of celebrating. Mrs. Nguyen sent soup, an actual container of faux liens number 7, delivered to the venue by her granddaughter, because Mrs. Nguyen did not close the restaurant on Saturdays, but understood the symbolism. Ethan wore a tie that he'd chosen himself, which was green and slightly too wide, and he wore it with the conviction of someone who has made an aesthetic decision and intends to see it through. He stood next to his father during the ceremony with his hands clasped in front of him, and his expression serious and attentive, and if he cried at any point, he did so privately, which was how he handled most things, taking after his father in that regard. Grayson had not prepared remarks. He'd thought about it for weeks and kept coming back to the same conclusion. The things he wanted to say were not the kind that benefited from prior composition. So when the officiant asked if he had words, he looked at Isla, standing in a simple dress the color of somewhere warm, hair loose, a small crease of nervousness at the corner of her mouth that he recognized and loved, and he said what was true. I've had a table for a long time, he said. I sat at it for years and it was fine, and I told myself fine was enough. And then one October night, I offered you a seat at it and you sat down. And I've been realizing since then that the table was never really mine. It was just where I was until you got there. Isla looked at him with that steady look, the one that had started on a cold sidewalk when she'd been trying to figure out his angle and hadn't found one. She was not crying, which he'd known she wouldn't. She cried privately, the same as Ethan, the same as him, the three of them a household of people who felt things deeply and handled them quietly. But her eyes were doing what they did when she was holding something too large to carry easily. I'll always make sure there's a place for you at my table, he said. That's the one thing I can promise without conditions. She nodded once, the small nod that meant she believed him. He'd learned to read it 7 months into their first year, back when she'd accepted his reason for not using his last name with a quiet okay that contained more trust than most formal agreements. After the ceremony, Ethan disappeared for a while and came back with something flat and folded under his arm, which he presented to Isla with the gravity he brought to his important things. It was the map, the final version. 6 sheets of paper taped together. The house at the center with its 4 walls and triangle roof, the neighborhood around it with its named streets, the small park with the bench, and the medium-sized dog in brown crayon that had taken 3 months to get anatomically right. At the center, in careful second-grade letters that were more confident now than when he'd first written it, home. It's done, he said. Isla took it carefully, the way you take something that someone has been working on for a long time and wants to be received correctly. She looked at it for a long moment. The whole thing. All 6 sheets. You left space here, she said, pointing to an area to the left of the house, slightly emptier than the rest. That's for things that haven't happened yet, he said. You can't put them in ahead of time. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the patient certainty of a child who has thought something through and is confident in the conclusion. That's actually very wise, she said. I know, he said. Can we have cake now? They had cake. Later, much later, after the guests had thinned and Ethan had fallen asleep in a chair, the way he always did at events that went past his usual bedtime, Grayson and Isla stood by the window of the small venue and looked out at the October night. The mountains were out there, visible in a way that mountains sometimes are at night, darker against the dark, but present, the kind of permanent that makes human scale feel small without making it feel unimportant. 2 years ago tonight, approximately, she said, give or take a few days. You were eating alone. I was always eating alone, he said. She looked at him. What were you thinking about? That night, before I came up to the table. He considered it honestly. My son's teacher said he'd been withdrawn. I was thinking about that, about how to reach him, about whether I was doing enough. He paused. About whether fine was really enough. I think I'd been thinking about that for a while and just not finishing the thought. And then I interrupted. And then you sat down, he said, which answered the question. She was quiet for a moment. What was the question? Whether the table had room for anyone else. Outside, Asheville held its position under the October sky, all its complications and its ordinary lives and its slowly changing systems going on the way they always did, indifferent to individual moments in the way that cities are indifferent, too large and too busy to notice the specific. The mountains were less indifferent. Mountains keep a different kind of record. Isla leaned against him, not dramatically, just settling her weight slightly toward his, the small physical grammar of two people who have decided to be in the same space for the long run. He put his arm around her, also without drama, the way you do a thing that has already become the natural extension of another thing. I've been thinking about what I would have done, she said, if you'd given me the leftovers. What do you think you would have done? Eaten them and left, she said. I wouldn't have come back. He thought about that, about the particular weight of small decisions, not the large ones that announce themselves as significant, but the ones that take about 3 seconds and feel, in the moment, like nothing much. I almost did, he said. Give you the leftovers. I had the bowl halfway across the table. She looked up at him. What stopped you? He didn't have a clean answer. He'd asked himself the same question in various ways over the past 2 years, and the best answer he'd found was also the most honest one. He'd stopped because something in him had known, in the 3 seconds available for the decision, that halfway was not enough. That the choice between the leftover bowl and the full one was not really about soup. It was about what you believe a person deserves before they've proven anything to you, before they've earned it or explained themselves or demonstrated that the investment is worth it. The specific decision of what to offer someone who's standing at the edge of your space with nothing to offer back yet. He believed in the full bowl. He always had, even in the years when his own life had been arranged around other priorities, and he'd lost sight of the fact. That belief had been the thing that got him back to himself eventually, more than the quiet or the distance or any of the deliberate choices he'd made about how to spend his time. The belief had always been there, waiting. I don't know, he said. I just knew the leftovers weren't right. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back out the window. That's the whole story, isn't it? She said. Not a question. That's the whole story, he agreed. Ethan slept in his chair, his green tie askew, the map folded on the table beside him, its center word facing up. The mountains kept their watch outside. The small October city went on with its ordinary, extraordinary life, and the two people at the window stood in the good weight of where they'd ended up, which was not where either of them had planned to be, and was better than anything they'd planned, and was entirely theirs. Not perfect, not finished, not without the particular anxieties and imperfections and unresolved edges that are the actual texture of a real life shared between real people, but home, whatever that word carried, whatever it held, it was that. It had been that, Isla would think later, almost from the beginning. She just hadn't known yet what to call it.